Hello children, and welcome to today's Bible story. It's a Sabbath day and Jesus and his disciples are walking through the fields. They're getting hungry and so they pick some grain to eat. Watching nearby are the Pharisees, and they come up to Jesus and they say, "Your followers, why do they do bad things on the Sabbath day?" You see, the Sabbath was important to God's people. We remember that God made all of the earth and everything in it, but he rested on the seventh day. The 10 Commandments were given to Moses, and the fourth command is keep the Sabbath holy. That meant that nobody could work on that day, no man or woman, their sons or daughters, their slave or servant, even their animals couldn't work on the Sabbath. Their meals would have to be made the day before so that it's ready for the Sabbath. Now Jesus replied to the Pharisees, and he reminded them about a story of King David. Now, King David had been chosen by God to be king, but he lived many, many years before. Having been chosen by God, he'd been anointed by the prophet Samuel, who'd poured oil on his head to show that he was a king. But at that time, King Saul was still on the throne. So David was like a king in waiting. And during that time, he wandered through the land with his followers. One day they all got very, very hungry. And David went into the house of God and he took the showbread. Now the showbread is a special type of bread that was made for God. But it could be eaten by the priests, but only by the priests. So King David didn't follow the letter of the law, but he did what was pleasing to God. Now Jesus goes on to say that Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. You see, the Pharisees knew the letter of the law. They knew all the very many laws there were. And they probably watched people to make sure they kept them. But that commandment had been given in love by God. He had wanted people to have a time of rest, a time that they could draw closer to him. He didn't want people to work and work and work. Then Jesus said, "The Son of Man," which means Jesus, "is the Lord of the Sabbath." Jesus has authority over the Sabbath. And we'll grow to understand that a little more in the next story. It's another Sabbath day, and Jesus has come to the synagogue. In the synagogue on that day also is a man with a withered hand. His hand had not grown properly. It must have been very difficult to do some ordinary everyday things like getting dressed or eating your food, and probably he couldn't work because of his very bad hand. It just hadn't grown properly. Now everyone in the synagogue wanted to see if Jesus would heal that man, because that would be breaking the Sabbath rules. But he calls the man forward and he says to the people, "Is it right to do good things on the Sabbath or to do bad things, to save a life or to kill?" Jesus was very angry because as he looked around he could see the hardness of people's hearts. And he said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." And the man stretched out his hand, and it was as good as new. It was just like his other hand. How happy he must have been. Imagine how he left the synagogue that day, praising God and thanking Jesus, because now he had a brand new hand. But it was at that moment that the Pharisees left. They wanted to find other people who didn't like Jesus. so they could plot together against Jesus. But Jesus had shown that he was indeed Lord of the Sabbath, because he'd shown the love and compassion that God gives. So we'll leave our Bible people here for a moment, and we'll see them again next time. Let's join together and sing the Sabbath song. 6 days shall you labour,